Hello, everyone. My name is Dave Wagner. I'm the VP of Product Marketing at InEight, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar on why the project planner doesn't always know best. Leading today's webinar is Dr. Dan Patterson. As a globally recognized project analytics thought leader and software entrepreneur, Dan has over 20 years of experience building project management software companies, including Pertmaster and Acumen. More recently, Dan founded Basis, a company that developed an artificial intelligence planning software tool that was acquired by InEight in 2018. Dan is now the Chief Design Officer at InEight, where he's focused on expanding upon his vision of creating next-generation planning and scheduling software solutions for the construction industry. He attended the University of Nottingham, where he earned a bachelor's degree in civil engineering and a PhD in construction management. So before I turn it over to Dan, a few quick logistical items. All the attendees on the phone are muted, but if you have a question, please enter it into the GoToWebinar questions dialog box. With the help of Paul Self, our Executive VP of Project Planning and Scheduling, Dan will field these questions at the end of the presentation. Also, we'll be distributing a link to Dan's presentation in the coming days. So with that said, Dan, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, David, for that very warm welcome, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you're dialing in from. Paul, I think we have you on the line as well, correct?
I'm here as well. Happy to be here.
Excellent. Well, between the two of us, I think we're going to have a fun 45 minutes sharing our thoughts on what is perhaps arguably a little bit of a provocatively titled webinar here, Why the Project Planner Doesn't Always Know Best. Now, in reality, the purpose of that title is really it's really in support of the project planner, because I think as an industry over the last 20 years, CPM planning, scheduling tools have certainly progressed, but I think even in 2019, the planner still largely operates in a silo. And what I mean by that, Paul, is, you sit in front of a scheduling tool and you may be responsible for putting the project plan and the schedule together, but that process and that tool set doesn't really lend itself to naturally or organically or collaboratively pulling in the expertise of people that ultimately know how to really plan the work, which is those people that are going to go and execute the project and be out there in field execution. So the seminar is less about shortcomings of the planner as an expertise, and really I think shortcomings from the tools that we've provided, but then more importantly, what we'd like to introduce together is somewhat of a mindset change and a better, more collaborative approach to building a CapEx cost and schedule forecast.
Sure, and capturing that expertise of the team, which is critical to a successful plan.
It is. It's interesting, Paul. You and I have worked together for many, many years on things like third-party schedule reviews, risk workshops, and I think first and foremost, having team member buy-in and consensus is probably the most important underpinning of an achievable schedule.
Yeah, I would agree, and that's probably thinking through those third-party interactive planning sessions. That's where we spend the bulk of our time is capturing the expertise of that team that's going to be responsible for executing the work. And finding a way to gain some level of consensus amongst those team members to ensure that they believe and buy into the plan that they're going to execute.
And again, I think that what's really interesting is the areas of the schedule that lack that consensus are probably the most important. They're the areas you need to pinpoint and focus on in terms of remediation and adjustment of schedule. So it's an interesting concept. So what we'd like to do is start off by touching on a little bit of theory, differentiating, I think, between planning versus scheduling. Obviously, this webinar is very much all about CPM scheduling and how to improve that science. So we'll touch on the traditional approaches along with some of the shortcomings of those approaches. In recent years, I think, again, the industry has made great strides with regards to not just presenting a deterministic, arguably best case scenario for cost and schedule forecast, but actually to present or to calculate what we call a risk adjusted schedule, taking into account the unknown, the good, the bad, the risks, the opportunities. I think that's a much more effective way of forecasting. Why would we not consider the potentially good things and potentially bad things that could alter our forecast when we put the plan together? And then that leads us into consensus-based planning. So let's take a look first of all at really just the differences between and some definitions. So scheduling versus planning. Paul, I think those phrases are used together. They're
almost synonymous, right?
They are, but in reality, I think that there's a discrete difference between what I think of as a scheduler and what I think of as a planner. I think of a scheduler as someone that breaks down a project into elements of work and then sequences them. I also believe that a scheduler absolutely understands the science of critical path methodology. They understand how to drive a CPM tool. Now, I can be the best Microsoft project or P6 or basis planner, but really ultimately, I'm really just the best scheduler. To be a solid planner, I have to have an inherent understanding of the project scope and then be able to convert that understanding into what is the true required work in order to achieve project completion. And when we look at CPM planning and scheduling today, Paul, I see really two types of user. I see planners and schedulers. And I think for a successful, realistic forecast, you need both. You need someone that can absolutely drive a CPM tool, that understands how to model constraints and different logic types and multiple calendars. And again, the building blocks in CPM. But then added to that, you have to have a planner that understands the scope of work and what it takes to execute that work.
Yeah, so I would completely agree. And I think what we've seen, probably over the course of really the last decade, right, is we're seeing a reduction in the number of true planner capabilities. We've got a retiring workforce. We've got individuals that are it can be at times, right, a transient workforce as well, right? They're moving from one location to the next, and we've got an influx of a new generation of schedulers and planners that don't necessarily have the expertise of 10, 15, 20 years of building project plans behind them yet. And so it's a bit of a brain drain that's taking place.
It is, and so I think that's why it's absolutely mission critical that when we put a plan together, we pull in that expertise from the discipline leads and the field executioners. And the quote on the right hand side, I truly believe is correct. A plan without buy-in isn't a real plan. It's merely a non-validated opinion. It's nothing more than that. So with regards to CPM scheduling, Paul, we've done numerous webinars and seminars on this topic. And again, I've preached for years that a deterministic schedule that you develop in a CPM tool, it's not the most likely scenario at all. It's the best case scenario. And the reason being, it doesn't take into account uncertainty and risk. And so why on earth do we spend so much time, effort, money investing in this CPM schedule, knowing that it's not the most likely, it's simply the best case scenario? I think another thing that is fascinating in a tragic way is the fact that in a traditional scheduling tool, you get to freely type in the durations. You can make the durations whatever you want. Well, that's utterly ridiculous. Duration is a result of how much stuff we're doing and the rate at which we can do it. Why don't CPM scheduling tools today take into account things like productivity rates and quantities? There's no underlying real basis of estimate. And again, if we could go back to the team and capture from the team, okay, historically, these are the productivity rates we were able to achieve. Well, that gives us a strong defense then to plug in to calculate a realistic duration. Somewhat of a technical challenge, but a CPM schedule is it's like a house of cards. It's held up by, or it's held together by what we call logic, and there's different types of logic, but ultimately, you can have one missing schedule link or logic link in a CPM schedule, and the entire schedule is fundamentally flawed. Paul, this is one of your hot topics, but separation or lack of separation between scope and work. You know, defining what it is we're building is one thing, but then how to build it is another thing. And again, I think over the years, the tools have mixed scope and work to the point that it actually becomes very hard to separate the two when putting the plan together.
Right, and so we miss quite a bit if we haven't fully detailed and broken down our scope. We don't know what essentially to plan against, which creates a flawed and unrealistic, not even a feasible plan from the onset.
Exactly. How can we measure the goodness of the plan if we're not measuring against something? Well, the scope of work is the something. Are we planning out the work in order to achieve the identified thing that we're building, the scope? And so, you know, I think going back to basics and saying, okay, let's firstly define scope. Let's break that scope down through WBS or work breakdown structures into work packages, into more detailed planning packages. That gives us the objective of the project. And then against that objective, how the heck are we going to achieve it? Well, we achieve it through sequence of work. That's when you get into the detailed activities and logic links. And honestly, I think CPM scheduling, from a puristic perspective, it's as simple as that. So I was introducing the concept of risk-adjusted scheduling, and Paul, I was giving the example of, you know, if I ask you for a forecast, instead of giving me a single value, then give me 3 points. Give me a best case, most likely worst case scenario. That can then form the input of our risk model. Not only that, tell me the potential risk events that could limit your ability to execute that work as planned. Does that make sense?
It does. It makes perfect sense. And then we take that through, you know, a series of simulations, right? Anywhere between 1,000 or 10,000 simulations to get a range of outcomes, right? And that's kind of what's depicted on the graphic on the right-hand side is what was our deterministic date? What does our risk-adjusted version of the schedule tell us in terms of a 10%, a 50%, a 90% probability of achieving a specific date, right?
Correct. And I think what's interesting about the concept of risk-adjusted scheduling is, yes, we're dealing with uncertainty and running things like simulation, but the risk-adjusted model that comes back is still a deterministic schedule. It is an absolute schedule against which we have a given confidence of either achieving or beating.
Great. And it still puts us in a bit of a, while it's a giant kind of leap forward in terms of CPM planning, we're still in a bit of a garbage in, garbage out type of situation, right? You have to have really good inputs into that risk model in order to actually have a feasible risk-adjusted schedule that you can be confident in as the output.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, okay, so risk-adjusted scheduling, as you said, it's a great step forward, but it's still reactive. You're effectively buffering your forecast, albeit with a quantitative, calculated degree of contingency. Well, wouldn't we be better off taking a step back and saying, well, instead of covering ourselves with this buffer or contingency, shouldn't we get the forecast right in the first place?
Yep, absolutely.
So that is really a good lead-in into an emerging subset of CPM scheduling. We call it consensus-based planning. And, you know, in many ways, Paul, this isn't an invention as such as an improvement. You could argue that consensus-based planning has been going on for years, where the planner will walk down the corridor and try and glean information from team members or send out an email and hope that they get a reply. It's very informal, it's very inefficient. A new, more modern way of doing that is to say, okay, well, what if we give the team members or the discipline leads the opportunity to, in their own time, buy into or push back on the schedule, so give their expertise, and then we gather all of those opinions to form a consensus. And again, what that allows us to do is pinpoint, in my mind, the areas of consensus are actually, they're not that important. They're the things that are good. I like to focus on the things that are bad so I can fix them. So pinpointing those areas of disagreement is a really effective way of understanding and pinpointing the weak points, the unrealistic segments within the schedule.
Right, so, and as you said, right, in reality, this isn't a new process. It's just a more efficient and accurate method of capturing and then kind of subsequently analyzing the opinion of the expert team.
It is, yep, and it's a very simple three-step process. You know, we invite and assign team members to review and give their expert opinion. We then capture that information, and we'll touch on this a little bit later on, Paul, but you know, a CPM planner typically has many years of experience in driving a CPM tool. Well, the people that carry the inherent knowledge of the project shouldn't be expected to be a Microsoft Project Primavera Basis guru, right? They're gurus in the field. So don't give them an interface. Don't give them a copy of a CPM tool and say, hey, go and fill out what you think the schedule is. That's what I think we've failed as a industry in terms of software tools that we've provided in the last 10 years.
Great. So you're going to walk us through how we actually accomplish that?
I am. So let's touch on this concept of markup. So think of markup, Paul, as it's your own personal sandbox for the plan. So, you know, I, the planner, invite you to give me feedback. You can provide feedback. You can comment and change durations. You can resequence. But all of those changes that you're making are within your own personal sandbox. They're not impacting the underlying project schedule. The other thing that I think is an important subtlety about this approach is there's no external influence. So as you are doing your pushback or buy-in, you're not concerned that you're sitting in a conference room with your project manager or your boss, perhaps giving a different opinion. You get to give an honest, open opinion without those external influences. Okay.
Okay.
And again, you know, the example on the right-hand side, in many ways, the fact that you're giving a very different opinion, you know, you're giving a 35-day opinion versus Bob, who gives a 60-day opinion, that's okay, because that in itself is pinpointing an area of weakness in the schedule. In the second example, the fact that both team members give the same or very similar opinions is nothing more than saying, yep, that's fine, we bought into it. We don't need to adjust that schedule. We need to adjust the first example where there's a lack of agreement.
So it's a way to surface all of that differing opinion. And again, it's okay to disagree with one another, and even almost more importantly, disagree with the original plan. But you can use this information to drive alignment amongst the team.
Yeah, so earlier when we introduced risk-adjusted scheduling, we have the concept of those risk ranges, those uncertainty ranges.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this isn't that different, right? You're generating a range of opinion through that markup process, even to the point where those ranges of opinions could even feed into your risk model if you wanted to.
Wow. Okay.
So the approach we've taken in the Basis software, we've adopted something called a scorecard, and we somewhat plagiarized the approach from survey tools. So we said, okay, we're not going to provide the contributors with a complicated Gantt chart. Instead, it's a very simple scorecard approach, and you literally get a fixed number of choices. In this case, 7 choices. You're either okay with the estimate or the forecast, or you believe there is more time required or less time required. And you know, even on a very large schedule, if I've been assigned to review 500 line items, because the approach is hierarchical, I can actually buy in or push back on chunks of scope, so multiple line items in a single click. So it's a really, really fast, effective way of me telling the computer as a team member or contributor what my opinion is on the work that I've been asked to review. I can also use this interface as a means of raising concerns, change requests. Perhaps there's risks that I am concerned about, again, within the context of the scope that I'm being asked to review. One of the really, I think, powerful aspects to this, Paul, is even as a non-CPM planner, as I'm giving my opinion to the computer through this scorecard, the computer then in real time tells me the knock-on effect of my opinion. In other words, you know, if I'm responsible for the engineering scope on a project, and I raise concern that I need more time to execute my engineering scope, in real time, the computer will tell me, okay, these are the areas, Dan, that longer duration engineering is going to impact. It may not impact the whole of downstream construction. It may only impact certain areas. So it's a really good way of explaining to me the cause and effect, or rather the effect from my opinion on the schedule.
Yeah, so it removes kind of the complexities and CPM related jargon, and asks the simple question: Can we do the work in the prescribed time frame or not? And if we're going to provide an opinion that's different than what the underlying schedule is suggesting, I can see the impact of my feedback as I'm entering it.
Exactly. Yep. So so we've kind of got it to the point now where we've introduced, okay, so you can take a schedule, or rather a plan. You can invite contributors to mark up that plan in those markup layers. In computing, in the computing world, it's very easy to split things up. It's actually quite hard to merge data together. And that actually is very, very true when it comes to taking those multiple markup layers, those multiple contributions from those contributors, and trying to, and this is not a technical phrase, but mush all of that back together. And so because of that, Paul, we actually by design did not design the software to do that automatically. Instead, what the software does is it presents back to the planner all of those markup layers from those multiple contributors, and then the planner can, and typically this is done in sort of an interactive schedule review with the contributors in the room, the planner gets to see all of those contributions, and again, they can be differing, and then the computer guides the planner through and says, okay, do you want to take the consensus? Do you want to take the average? Do you want to take the best case? Do you want to take the most pessimistic opinion? Do you want to take the opinion of the discipline lead that has the most experience in this area of work? And so it's a very easy to use interface, and in real time, again, we call it flattening. Those multiple potentially differing opinions get flattened back, and they actually update the underlying schedule. So it's really closing the loop on building the plan, getting the feedback on the plan, and then pushing that feedback where relevant back down into the underlying schedule.
Yeah, so we talked about earlier in the presentation, risk assessments, risk workshops, interactive planning sessions. This is a function of the tool set that would be so valuable in one of those interactive planning sessions, because now I can, more often than not, when you sit down in an interactive planning session with your team, it's the team trying to come to consensus within the room with each other, without necessarily having the benefit of having reviewed the schedule first. So more often than not, we're tuning the organization into the schedule and how the work is actually sequenced. Whereas in this, you could sit down with do an interactive planning session, and in real time see the impact of everybody's contribution into the plan, and selectively incorporate the right feedback into the schedule and promote the conversations that need to take place, rather than simply reviewing the schedule.
Yeah, it takes the emotion out of it as well, right? Because prior to the interactive schedule review, the contributors will have already given their expert opinion. The tool then calculates the consensus and the average, so on and so forth. It presents the facts. It also gives you an audit trail as to who said what, so that 6 months from now, if you've updated your schedule and baselined it based on the schedule review this week, and then 6 months from now, you're reviewing it, the tool will actually track and retain who said what and also why.
Great.
We've also introduced some clever analytics as well. So, consensus is somewhat of a subjective, qualitative approach, I would say. We've tried to quantify that with some analytics. So we don't just, give you, or the computer doesn't just present the average, it gives a range of consensus. Voice analysis, this is one of my favorites, Paul. So as the team review the differing opinions and those opinions go back into the plan, the tool will track how much of each contributor's opinion makes it back. Now, where that's useful is you can actually then start to track, oh, well, we have consistently a pessimistic contributor here, or in your case, Paul, always overly optimistic. Yes, we can get it done earlier. Well, that's great, Paul, but how does that reflect on our historical performance? So it doesn't just help with making your plan more realistic, it actually helps track and normalize some of those overly, some of those biases, I would say, put it that way.
Yeah, we can certainly eliminate plan bias by going through this type of a process.
Yep. Okay, so I think that's enough slides. I think we should perhaps just do a little walkthrough as to how this works in the software itself. So I'm going to build a plan very quickly. We'll invite some reviewers. Paul, I'm going to call upon you to be one of those reviewers, and then perhaps you can walk us through that markup process, and then we'll pull it back together with the review cycle. If that's okay.
Yep, that's great.
Okay, so let's go ahead and very, very quickly create a project. So I'm going to play the role of a project planner, and I'm going to very quickly build a project, really simply for the purpose of being able to invite our contributors to the plan. And Paul, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I know we've spent time in previous sessions showing the speed of building a plan within a tool like Basis.
Right, we have. So we're going to concentrate on let's get the right team members assigned to a specific scope area of the plan, and then capture their feedback and opinion.
Yep. Okay, so here's my schedule that I've just pulled in from what I call my knowledge library. I've pulled in some templates. I simply told the computer the type of project that I was working on, and it came back with suggested durations and logic links and scopes, so on and so forth. So let's jump straight into that review process. So Paul, I'm going to focus in on construction.
Okay.
And as part of that, I'm actually going to invite some contributors to give me feedback on the project. Okay, so Mr. Keith Anderson there, Ben Heitz, Paul Self, and Christy Tuppence. Okay, so what I'm doing, Paul, is I'm saying, look, there's 4 contributors here that I would like to capture their expert opinion on with regards to the construction scope of my project.
Okay.
Okay, so it's as simple as assigning them. We call them reviewers. So they will get assigned as reviewers, or in slang terms, we call them marker-uppers.
And then you're going to kick off the review cycle?
I'm going to kick off the review cycle. So I'm going to say, please review. So all being well, those 4 contributors now will receive an email, and we might even hear your Outlook make a little ding.
I did just receive my email.
You should have done a pretend ding there, Paul. Ding! There you go. Okay, so with that, Paul, you should now be able to start your markup process, right? So,
I can.
And whilst you're doing that, let me show on the screen to the audience what you will be experiencing during that markup process. So first of all, Paul, you're only getting exposed to the construction scope, because that was the only area of scope that I asked you to give me feedback on. And within that construction scope, what you're seeing is you've got foundations, structure, multiple floors, interior, so on and so forth. And the approach that you're taking here is you're going to start with foundations, and you're going to look at the entire duration of foundations, 150 days approximately. And you could say, okay, I'm very comfortable with that based on the scope of work. So you're effectively flagging that entire scope as being okay. Now, what's interesting here is you did a single click and it cascaded down to the 5 activities within the foundational scope. You can then, by exception, flag individual activities. So when we look at the pouring and curing, the 45-day duration here, you could push back and say, actually, I need significantly more time, maybe 50% more. And what you'll see on the screen here is, because of your request for additional time for pour and cure, the subsequent enclosure scope now, even though it takes the same amount of time, will actually occur 33 days later. So that's a really good example of knock-on effect. The actual enclosure work, yes, the duration's right, but you're getting hit in the back there from the preceding pour and cure work. So you can walk the entire schedule and do that ranking process. Again, it's hierarchical. You can drill down floor 1, 2, and 3. perhaps they're okay, but floor 1 has a learning experience that would perhaps take a little bit more time. So again, we're giving different rankings to different scopes of work. And then as part of this markup process as well, this is an opportunity for you, Paul, as a team member, to also raise things like issues, risks, and concerns. So on that structural scope, you could say concern about quantity of steel. Okay, and perhaps you want to give that a probability and a potential schedule impact. And again, for those of you that capture risks in a project risk register, you'll know that it's quite a tedious process to build out those risk registers, not in Basis, because the contributors are actually building the risk register on the fly as they give their feedback. So that's a simple demonstration of how you would mark up the schedule. At the top here, there's a little progress indicator giving the marker upper an indication as to how much buy-in versus pushback they have on the schedule. And then when they're ready for me, the planner, to start reviewing their input, it's as simple as clicking the Ready for Review button.
Great, and I've submitted some of my feedback as well.
Okay, so I can actually, as the planner, Paul, I can see in real time who has made those contributions. I can see that Ms. Tuppence here is requiring overall 57% of the schedule she believes needs more time. Mr. Self, 21% more time. But actually, you're pretty bought into the schedule. In fact, 66, 2/3 of the durations in the construction scope you are very comfortable with a small number, 13%, even requiring less time. Interestingly, Mr. Anderson here, similar opinion to you, Paul. What will be interesting in a few minutes, though, is to see whether it's the same areas of scope that you guys agree on or not.
Right.
Okay. And we can see here Mr. Patterson actually didn't complete his homework, but he did give some contribution, and he's a little bit more skeptical there for what he did mark up, overall requiring more time. Okay. So let's take a deeper look at that now. So we gather the team together. We walk through an interactive schedule review session, as we said, and we are going to focus on construction. So at the what I call the root level, Paul, so construction as a whole, really interesting annotations here. You see these little green and orange sort of backdrops on the bars?
I do.
So what this is telling me is, as a result of you guys giving me feedback, are those areas of scope within construction, are they still within the overall boundaries, the overall phases that I defined as a planner? Okay, so green is yes, we're still within a given threshold. Orange is no, we've actually breached. So things like my foundational scope and my structural scope, they're still good. Look, they're all green. But because of knock-on effect, as I go through construction all the way to the end, I'm punching through, which is now giving me an overall longer construction period than I planned. It's longer by a given threshold, so it's turning orange. I get a thumbs down. So it's almost like, well, it's not just like, it's benchmarking you guys' opinion against what I built as the lead planner.
So you can immediately see whether or not the team, at least as a whole, believes in the plan that was developed.
I can see off the bat whether or not the team's opinion is punching through our threshold or tolerance for against the original plan that we put together.
Okay, great.
And then the next level down on the right-hand side, I can see the various contributors, and I can see how many activities they bought into, how many they actually think were conservative and require less time, conversely, how many they thought required more time. And then again, drilling down into a bit more detail at the actual individual activity level. So within our foundational scope, grading and support here, again, we've got 3 opinions. So I, as the planner, said 20 days. Paul, you said 22 days. There's a variation in those opinions. Now let's go to stub in utilities. You'll see here the range is actually starting to increase quite a bit. It goes from 13 days to 19 days. So that broader range gets graphically reflected in this column here, this little mobile cell phone tower, this gives me a percentage variation. So the lower the cell phone signal in the chart here, the lower degree of consensus. So immediately I would pinpoint, okay, poor and cure. We've got a 28% variation. That's not good. So let's take a look at that. So, anywhere from 33 days to, my gosh, 68 days. That's interesting. I wonder why. Well, Keith said he raised a particular, I guess, means of improving that. If we go back to stub in utilities, Keith raised a site access delays. So not only are you getting the opinion as to, okay, yes, I need more time or less time, you're also getting reason why through those raised issues, risks, and action items.
Great.
Okay, so one thing I didn't show you, and that's probably the most important thing in this screen, Paul, is, okay, based on those opinions, what the heck do you do with them? So you can choose to include, exclude opinion. You could take everybody's opinion and form a consensus and commit it. Or you can take an individual activity here and say, actually, there is a single contributor. In this case, we just want Keith's contribution to go back into the plan. And again, really interesting there. Look, we took Keith's opinion on drainage, and because of that, the subsequent structural work now has breached our norms with regards to the time period that we had allocated. It turned from green to orange. So because of Keith's concern of drainage, or about drainage, we're now going to be late to the point on structural installation, where we're now out of compliance with our tolerance.
So we can in real time, as we walk the schedule in like an interactive planning session, we can start to see the impact of incorporating feedback from the team.
Correct. Yep. So we've really, we've come full circle, right? Because I created the plan, you guys reviewed it, your opinion has now made it back into the plan. This is iterative planning, right? It's iteratively getting more realistic. It's iteratively gaining more and more buy-in.
Great. And I could also flatten the team's opinion from a grouping of activities as well, right? I don't have to go all the way down to the activity level should I choose not to.
Yes, I mean, in fact, to take that to the extreme, Paul, you could go all the way back up to construction, and you could say, okay, I want these 3 contributors' opinion across the board to get committed to my plan, and boom, did you see the overall change to the schedule there?
I did.
Yep. And in fact, we go down to finishes. What's interesting is the net here almost zeroed out. Look, so yes, we were starting further up in the food chain here, or in the chain of events here. We're starting to get some big deltas early on, but because of float later on in the construction scope, the float is absorbing those delays to the point where the net at the end is almost zero. So it's a really cool way of seeing, okay, how is this actually going to impact the finish of the project?
Great.
So taking this concept of gathering opinion and consensus really beyond just CPM scheduling, what we've done is we've said, okay, well, those ranges of opinions, shouldn't they just really form the basis of your risk models? So that's exactly what we've done. As the team members give their opinion, the computer captures those ranges, and then in the tool, I'm jumping around a bit here, Paul, but actually within the tool itself, you can push those ranges of uncertainty directly into other commercial risk analysis tools to do your subsequent Monte Carlo analysis.
So it can be used as the bait. You can make sure that you've got, because we said it earlier, right? Garbage in, kind of garbage out scenario with a risk model. Now that I have the team's opinion captured and I've reviewed it, I've got a much higher chance of having valid inputs into that risk model.
Yep. So going back to the Monte Carlo, the concept of Monte Carlo risk modeling. So I think most people now are becoming familiar with running the simulation. I think, though, people are still uncomfortable with the concept of triangular versus uniform versus trigen distributions and what those numbers should be. Well, for the first time, I believe we've eliminated all of that junk, because the team members don't even have to think about that stuff. Give me your expert opinion, and the software now will generate those ranges, even to the point where it can generate the distribution type based on the number of inputs from multiple team members.
Great.
So it's a really, really important step forward. Now, if you think that's an exciting step forward, imagine this. How useful would it be if, as the team members are giving their opinions, if in real time as the planner pool, we could actually see the risk impacted version of the schedule?
Oh, well, that would be hugely helpful.
Okay, well, not to let the cat out of the bag in terms of where we're going with this concept of consensus-based planning, but well, I guess we did just let the cat out of the bag, right? But we are moving towards the point where in real time you will see the risk-adjusted version of the schedule. So yes, I want I'm building my plan in real time. Show me the the P75 version of my project based on team members' input with regards to uncertainty and also the risk events that they're identifying as well. And to me, that's where CPM should be as a science. That's where we need to go towards as an industry. I think it's great that we started off 50 years ago with this CPM concept. Then we introduced things like risk analysis on top. Then we introduced things like, well, let's make sure the logic's right and the checks and balances. They've all been historical incremental steps to making the science better. At the end of the day, if what we're really trying to get to is a plan that incorporates risk and uncertainty, computers are powerful enough today that they should be able to show us that stuff in real time, given the fact that we're capturing that input from team members in real time as well.
And then we're not only reactive, right? At the base level, we're truly being proactive and predictive in terms of what we think the outcome of a plan would be.
Exactly. We move more into predictive planning. So I think we focused a lot on the human aspect and using the computer in a smarter way to capture that human input. With the advent of artificial intelligence, I think there is another contributor that we absolutely have to take into account, and that contributor pool is history. It's our historical performance. It's how did we do previously? And again, because of things like AI now, that historical performance can be so easily captured, but more importantly, so easily interrogated that historical performance in itself should be treated as one of those contributors. So in our example, we had 4 team members contributing. Well, in reality, BASIS actually takes into account 5 contributions, the 4 humans plus the AI contributor in the form of mining that historical information. And again, I think that's hugely powerful, especially then if you say, okay, well, the 4 human contributors, as they give contribution, shouldn't they also then automatically update the knowledge library and update those historical norms? And that's exactly how that closed loop AI engine works within the BASIS software.
That's fantastic. We saw that really kind of in real time as we were incorporating the team's feedback. We saw when we breached certain timeframes and duration benchmarks, and imagine we believe in the plan that we built, we can introduce that plan back into the knowledge library and use it the next time.
Exactly, and as I know I built my plan very, very quickly in the beginning there, but as I was building the plan, I don't know if you saw, I actually asked the computer, the AI contributor, to go off and pull in the activities and logic for that type of project.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in terms of progression and the improvements, I think we are definitely marching towards more of a balanced approach to planning. I think even though we didn't hammer it too heavily, this concept of using the computer and artificial intelligence as an equal team member, as one of those contributors, it's so easy now to take historical performance and store it in a knowledge library. That then in turn helps with the speed of plan creation. You saw how quickly it was for me, the planner, to build the plan. Mm-hmm. I get to benchmark that plan against those historical norms. And another thing that I think is key as well is, in the old days when I put a plan together, I didn't really know whether I'd captured all of the scope or not. So this concept of checking for completeness is really, really important. When you then add the 4 human contributors that we had in our example, I think first and foremost, it's driving ownership. It's driving team members down the path of saying, yes, I believe in this schedule, or in the case where they don't believe in the schedule, at least them having a voice to make a change to the schedule, right? So that feedback back to the planner, it's all driving this concept of ownership and buy-in. And again, as a secondary benefit, being able to then capture that opinion, if that opinion is then different to what the computer has in the knowledge library, then great, the knowledge library can automatically adjust. There's this concept of machine learning, and that's part of the basis product, where the knowledge in the knowledge library is constantly being updated based on the updates that are coming from the contributors. And of course, that all drives it drives efficiency for building the plan. But I think first and foremost, it's taking us down the path of, when it comes to forecasting time and money, we are as an industry now moving finally down the path where we're building more accurate forecasts, and our confidence in those forecasts is much higher. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Execution is not the root cause of project failure. It's our inability to realistically plan. And that this concept of collaboration and consensus-based planning, I believe, is another step in the right direction to improving that confidence.
Well, that's fantastic, and thank you for walking us through that today. We did have a couple of questions pop up. One was, what happens to the feedback from the team after you flatten it? Is it retained in any way?
Yeah, so the feedback obviously makes it back into the plan, but then there is an audit trail where the computer will record who said what and when, so you can look back and see trending of that information.
So we could almost check who was right.
Yeah, so actually, if you really wanted to take that to the extreme, when you finish the project, very useful to be able to go back and say, okay, who was closest to the actual? And you can do that in Basis by pulling in the actualized schedule and comparing the markup to that actualized schedule.
You could actually benchmark it against itself.
Yes, and we actually call that self-benchmarking.
Great. So, and then there was another question. I think you briefly showed this. Can a team member provide a specific duration input?
Can a team member during the markup process?
During the markup process, can they tell you a finite duration, or is it all through the scorecard?
Oh, so the default and the encouraged approach is scorecarding. You can override that and put in discrete values by interacting with the activity bars. Yes.
Okay, great. So they could specify a specific duration as well.
They can, yes.
Great. Well, that's those were all the questions we had. So thanks for Dan for walking us through this concept of capturing human intelligence and how it can make our plans much more achievable and, quite frankly, better.
Well, you're very welcome. And again, I think we are and always have been driven by improving the science of CPM. And while this isn't the be-all, end-all, magic answer, I think it is a material significant step in the right direction.
Great. Well, I would agree wholeheartedly. So thank you all for joining us today. Our next Basis webinar will be in April, and we'll send out an invitation and communications on that webinar in the coming weeks, and we hope to see you there. Thanks again for joining.
Thanks all.